After they were awakened by the loud singing of birds and the first rays of the sun, they found that their little party had been reduced by one man during the night. Gone was Grumpy, a tall man of about 50 years of age, with a face as if carved out of weathered old limestone covered with potholes and cracks. No one knew where he had gone. After Stoneface took a short roll call, it turned out that all 5 people remembered that Grumpy was still sitting by the fire when everyone went to bed. "I told you he was one of the dead," Bubble said. Despite the best efforts of their 15-year-old owner, his red, boyish curls stubbornly refused to stay under the headband Bubble had made from an old, once green flannel shirt. The locks fell over his face and partially covered his eyes, giving Bubble a swaggering look, like those sword-wielding horsemen who forced them yesterday to hide in the ruins of the big stadium until the wave had rid the group of the deadly threat. "I thought so right away. Something about him didn't seem right. Definitely dead." No one paid any attention to what he said. Despite his age, Bubble had a lot of different qualities that were useful for the group's survival, but silence was not one of them. Simply put, he was constantly rambling about something. That's how he got his nickname. One evening after dinner, Chunk, tired of his chatter, threw an apple stump at the boy and said, "What a bore, bubbling like a pot forgotten on the fire." And so it stuck. However, Grumpy's disappearance still alarmed Stoneface and the old man, who, as the most experienced travelers, led the group. No matter what Bubble said, Grumpy could not be one of the dead. He had joined the group almost a month ago, and in that time, they had experienced at least 6 or 7 waves, including 2 big ones. But why would a sane person go out in the middle of the night? Grumpy wasn't much into talking, but he made it clear that he fully shared the group's goals and was ready to go with them to the end. "All right," the old man said at last. "We didn't kick him out, and we didn't invite him. He can care for himself, and it's none of our business. The wave has just passed, so he's not in danger anytime soon. We can't go looking for him. We gotta move." All agreed on that, and they really needed to keep moving. According to the maps the old man kept in the waterproof case that hung from a lanyard around his wiry neck, the Altar of Chaos was still at least a few days away. Despite the nickname, Old Man wasn't really that old. He was hardly over a decade older than Stoneface, who claimed to be in her late 30s. Bubble gave him the nickname for totally gray hair. Everyone in the group tried at least once or twice to ask the old man what had happened to his hair, but as soon as someone started talking about it, the old man just shut up, staring blankly into nowhere, and not even bothering to say no. Usually, a couple of attempts were enough, not counting Bubble, who was constantly pestering everyone with stupid questions. But he was easy to ignore. That was part of the mandatory skill set for everyone who joined their group. After a quick breakfast, the pilgrims gathered their belongings and set off along the forest's edge to the northwest. They had to make up for the time lost because of yesterday's dead riders. They moved in the usual order. Chunk was in the lead as the strongest and ready for any surprises. Stoneface followed him, ready to assess any danger and give appropriate orders. Then the old man, Bubble, and Chima, thin, wiry, with a face mangled by scars and the homemade spear in her right hand. Before his disappearance, Grumpy had usually walked between Bubble and Chima, and now Bubble was ranting on and on about how the damn dead man had been staring at his back for weeks and how he, Bubble, wouldn't be able to sleep at night because of it, and his back was already blistered from that damn dead look. It was impossible to shut him up. Finally, Chima tapped him lightly with the shaft of her spear under his knees, saying briefly, "Be quiet." That worked. If Bubble was really afraid of someone, it was not of the missing Grumpy, and not even of the dead, but of Chima. It was Chima who had once saved him from a completely hopeless situation when he, lost in his thoughts, wandered where he shouldn't have, and ended up stuck between two large groups of dead dressed in military uniforms fighting each other. Instead of spears or swords, they were armed with firearms. The guns were so advanced that they spat out deadly lead, without smoke, but in rapid bursts. Bubble lay, trying hard to squeeze into a small hollow and merge with the withered grass, while the dead did their best to make a sieve out of each other. His memory told him that the nearest wave, which would dissolve the dead to the boundless ether, from which they had suddenly returned by the whim of the universe, was still at least a day away. He was about to say goodbye to his life when suddenly he heard a shriek from the flank, then another, and another. He didn't dare to move so as not to give away his location, trying to make out what was going on by the sounds. It sounded like something really weird was happening. On the side where the screams were coming from, the gunshots became less and less frequent until they stopped completely. On the other side, the gunfire also seemed to thin out. The dead from that group were probably puzzled and decided to pause briefly to consider the situation and make a better decision. Bubble's thoughts were racing, but before he could figure out what to do, someone tugged at his leg, and a muffled voice from behind said, "Come on, move. We've got to get out of here before they wake up." It wasn't until 40 minutes later, when they were a safe distance from the gunfight, that Bubble fully reconstructed what he had seen during his escape and vomited. Chima had already washed off the blood from her hands and face in a small puddle, carefully cleaned the long, double-edged blade-like tip of her spear, and was looking thoughtfully at the squirming Bubble. When he stopped shuddering, she took a flask from her belt and handed it to him. It was clear water. He rinsed his mouth and spit, then took a few sips and returned it. You finished them off. All of them," he said with difficulty. The sight of the mangled dead bodies and the lean, wiry figure, head to toe splattered with blood, came back into view. A lump came to his throat again, but Bubble had already thrown up everything he could. Chima shrugged. "I should have gotten you out. They were in the way." He didn't find anything to say. He tried several times later to find out from Chima how she'd managed to determine that he was alive, accidentally caught up in a snippet of a long-forgotten War of the Dead. All he'd gotten from her was a crooked grin and a shake of her head. She gave the same response to other pilgrims who were trying to figure out where she was from and why she had decided to join the group, with one exception. On the first evening, when Bubble led them to the camp, Stoneface took Chima aside, and they talked quietly for a long time. After that, Stoneface returned to the fire and looked at the people sitting around with her unblinking gaze. "We have a new addition," she said. "Chima," she nodded at Bubble's savior, "wants to join us. I agree. If anyone is against it, speak up." No one said a word. Stoneface was trusted. In fact, anyone could go on a pilgrimage to the altar of chaos. All they had to do was express their desire to join the group. According to long-standing tradition, there were no criteria, but the group leader could reject a candidate based on internal considerations. However, no one could prevent the rejected person from following the pilgrims at some distance. The old man said that, in the old days, sometimes entire caravans would line up. The original group, followed by another group of those who were not taken, then another, and another. Stoneface's group usually didn't take anyone who could be suspected of being dead, though even that wasn't a universal rule for those wishing to become pilgrims. Stoneface believed it was unwise to take into the group those who might suddenly disappear after the next wave. That's why she conducted a thorough interview with each candidate, and that's why Grumpy's sudden disappearance had a depressing effect on everyone. Was Stoneface wrong? And if so, which one of them could also, in fact, be dead? Strictly speaking, there was nothing particularly horrible about it. Not all dead who suddenly surfaced from the unimaginably distant past through the folds of sprawling reality were dangerous. Sometimes, of course, the mad world brought to the surface shards of past violence, like yesterday's bloodthirsty riders with long swords in their hands and carbines behind their shoulders, or the two groups in gray and green uniforms that Bubble had run into. Sometimes, the dead were perfectly ordinary people, often confused and disoriented by the strange world that had suddenly summoned them from oblivion. Naturally, most were looking for some sort of support in this new existence, and many saw such support in joining the pilgrims. They were sometimes willing to go along with the group, even after being told what awaited them. While all these thoughts were running through Bubble's mind, the group had managed to cover a decent distance. They cautiously made their way around a small grove surrounded by rusty barbed wire. There was no telling what might be lurking in the depths of the grove behind the trees, but the barbed wire hinted at unpleasant surprises. There were unlikely to be any freshly aggressive dead there, but old anti-personnel mines were a far more real danger. For some mysterious reason, inanimate objects were sometimes left as a legacy to the world after a new wave dematerialized another batch of dead. The group paused for lunch in the shade of a huge rusty ship. The old man called it a tanker, though no one but him had any idea what that word meant, that had somehow found itself deep in the mainland, a good 1,000 kilometers from the nearest sea. "We're going at a good pace," Stoneface commented, chewing the last of the galette. "If we can keep it, we should be able to catch up by tomorrow night." She looked at the small indicator on the stopper of the test tube into which she had scooped water from a nearby spring. "Green, so it's clear. I advise everyone to take water. We'll go without stopping until evening." "What's the rush?" Bubble asked. "The altar of chaos, if it exists at all, is not going anywhere. The old man said the thing had been there for hundreds of years, if not more. So what's the point of burning the heels?" Stoneface looked at the old man. He sighed and shook his head, as if to say, "Please, not again." "The world is unstable," he said, "and it's getting worse. I have a simple question, not only for you," he nodded to Bubble, "but for you as well." He turned to Chima and Chunk. "How well do you remember your childhood? Where you were born, where you grew up, who were your parents?" "That's some question," Chunk snorted. "You can't make it simpler. I remember my family as if I see them right here. And I was born in, that place near the... Dude, how was it called?" His face changed into a range of feelings. Confusion, embarrassment, anger, surprise. "You must be kidding me," he finally said, dazed. "What the hell? How did you do that?" The old man looked at Chima. The girl's disfigured face contorted into a grimace that was remotely reminiscent of a sneer. "I was born and raised in hell," she said calmly. "That's all I need to know and remember." Bubble remained silent. In fact, he had long since gotten used to the strange memory lapses, and since he never knew otherwise, he assumed that this was the way it was supposed to be, that this was how memory worked in any living person. And he didn't care what the dead thought, if they had any thoughts whatsoever. But now it seemed from the old man's words, it's not right. "Those whom you call dead aren't dead at all," old man said. "I mean, the term is accurate in one sense. All these people really died, some of them even a long time ago. We don't know how long, though. However, the ones we see are not real people resurrected. Rather, they are reflections of their past in our reality, ephemera." Ephemera, you say, Bubble said, remembering the rumble of machine gun fire, the bullets whizzing over his head, and the recent sword-wielding horseman who had chopped up a group of unarmed dead they had accidentally encountered on the road. To me, they're very tangible and real, more so than I'd like. And yet, under the influence of the waves, they instantly disappear without leaving a trace. Well, except for the occasional item or ruin. That's how we distinguish the living from the dead. The waves don't affect us. Well, they do, but not as much as the ephemera. I don't feel affected? Bubble poked himself with a finger in the chest, then wanted to pat Chima on the shoulder, but quickly changed his mind after meeting her gaze. Nothing ephemeral. The old man sighed. What did I just say about memory? We forget what we are and who we used to be. I know it, because when I look at my notes, he patted the case with scraps of maps. I see that they are all done by my hand, but now I can't say I understand everything written there. All that remains is a vague feeling that I once knew everything, but can't remember. That's why we must hurry. Stoneface entered the conversation. The old man is the only one who can get us to the altar of chaos. And we have to get there before he loses all his memory of what his maps mean under the influence of the waves, or whatever affects us. What is this altar of chaos anyway? Chunk asked suddenly. I got that this thing is supposed to somehow fix the stuff, make the world normal again, or at least a little more normal. But what is it, and how does it work? It was an incredibly long and meaningful rant for Chunk. Everyone stared at him in surprise. Chunk even looked embarrassed, which was also out of character. Well, I was just thinking, he said. I want to understand. Everyone wants to understand, the old man said. Me in the first place. The trouble is nobody knows for sure. Maybe it's some device from the past or a magical artifact that affects reality. There's no such thing as magic, Chima said confidently. Everyone knows that. But we can't prove it, can we? Said the old man. Whatever it is, my notes show that in the past, pilgrimages have sometimes ended with relative success. Afterward, the invasion of the dead was somewhat halted, and the living stopped losing their memories. He smiled sadly. Perhaps I used to know more, but now I can only recount what I've read. Have you ever been on a pilgrimage before? Bubble suddenly asked. The old man was silent again for a long time. His eyes wandered absent-mindedly, occasionally stopping on one of the pilgrims. I wish I knew, he said at last gravely. Perhaps that's why I'm going there. For the first time during the pilgrimage, Bubble had no words to quip. In silence, they gathered their belongings and started northwest again. 2 days later, they bumped into a major problem. As they crested the top of a fairly high hill that dominated the steppe terrain, punctuated here and there by small groves of skinny trees, the group froze, staring in confusion at the landscape before them. The huge city, stretching along the banks of the wide river, glittered with the glass of high-rise buildings, smoked with factory chimneys, and teemed with an incomprehensible number of inhabitants. As bad as their memory had become, all pilgrims were certain that they had never seen a settlement close to the scale of the one before them. Of course, they encountered majestic ruins several times on their way, long since reclaimed back by nature. Once in a while, they could meet dead in these ruins, but those were few in number and usually looked even more lost than the pilgrims themselves. Until the next wave carried them back to oblivion. The ruins were also marked on the old man's map. He even showed all pilgrims the blue crooked scribbles on the yellowed paper. A bold red cross was sitting like a spider in the corner of the map. What's that? Bubble immediately poked at the cross. Is it a place where a treasure is buried? Or is it some kind of keep out, it'll kill you place? The old man shook his head slowly. This is where we're headed, he said, pointing to one of the buildings on the far side of town. It wasn't the tallest or the most elegant, but it still stood out from the surrounding buildings. A huge block of gleaming black glass. If the map is right, that was where the altar of chaos is located, or was, before all this came along. Stoneface lowered the binoculars. It's fresh dead down there, she said. You can see a certain amount of excitement inside, but the people are generally calm. On the outskirts, they are surprised to find an unfamiliar landscape around the city, but they haven't even sent out search parties yet. Uniformed guards are stopping all their cars at the exits, but so far, no one is rushing out. The old man's hands sagged helplessly. The pieces of paper clutched in his fingers started to tremble. According to my calculations, we should have reached the altar of chaos in 2 days at the latest. We can't wait for another wave. What if it's too late? What if it affects us? We could lose all memory up to this day. Forget who we are and where we're going. Tears came to his eyes. We've already forgotten so much, but I wanted to believe, that we would know what to do once we found the altar of chaos. Stoneface walked over to him and gently placed a hand on his shoulder. There's nothing we can do right now, she said. We'll have to wait. Chima picked up her spear and reached out for Stoneface's binoculars. I'll take the first watch until you make camp, she said. I've seen a good spot in a clearing about 100 paces from here. There's 1.5 miles of open ground between us and the town, so we'll have time to get away if we need to. She slung the strap of the binocular case over her head. Just don't start an open fire. We don't want to attract unnecessary attention. The next morning, Chunk disappeared. This time, even Bubble was silent. Chunk, an ordinary-looking man of sturdy build, typical of people who had been engaged in hard physical labor all their lives, had been in the group before him. He, Stoneface, and the old man had been the original core of the pilgrimage, joined later first by Bubble, then, after his rescue, by Chima, and finally by Grumpy. It was really hard to believe that he could be a very stable dead, almost impossible. But it seemed even more impossible that Chunk could just get up like that and leave in the middle of the night, shortly after Stoneface had replaced him at the observation post. Chunk had taken over the second watch, replacing Chima when the sun had already dropped below the distant horizon, and the city was twinkling with many yellow and colored lights. When the initial shock and confusion passed, Chima said that she had heard Chunk return to the camp and seemed to go to bed. But then she fell asleep and could not tell when he had walked away. Both women looked at Bubble, but the latter spread his hands. He always slept soundly, and cautious footsteps would not disturb him. If the old man had spotted him, we'd have known about it by now, Stoneface said. The old man took over the watch from Chunk. But we'd better check on him anyway. We'll have a quick snack and go to him together. Something tells me it's not a good idea to split up right now. Instead of answering, Chima reached into her backpack for supplies. Bubble almost expected to see the old man asleep or no one at all at his post. However, their guide was there. He was sitting with his back against a small boulder, watching the huge city waking up in the distance. His reaction to the news of Chunk's disappearance was unusually calm, almost indifferent. I'm sorry, he said, not addressing anyone. There wasn't much regret in his voice. But we can't go through that. No way. He nodded at the city. They're getting restless, forming detachments from the local guards, pushing people back home. Maybe we should have tried to get through right away, try to dissolve into the crowds. Now, we will be visible on the empty streets like the sun in the sky. Shall we try to go around? Chima jabbed her spear to the west toward the building the old man said was the site of the altar of chaos. What's the use? Stoneface said. It's not like the building is on the very outskirts. You can't just walk up to it like that. Chima shrugged. At least we'll be closer to it. What other options do we have? It's my fault, the old man said suddenly. I led you all here. To a dead end. I'm the one who persuaded Chunk to leave his village and go on the pilgrimage. And now we're all going to die here. Bubble looked at his older companions in confusion. Over the weeks of the pilgrimage, he had grown accustomed to his role as the camp jester, who could say whatever he wanted while relying on those who were undoubtedly older and more experienced than he was. But now his habitually blank memory suddenly threw up a few colorful memories. Pictures of why he had originally left his home village in the first place and wandered the wild wastelands until he joined the pilgrims. These images made him shudder, and his heart beat harder, and he spoke with sudden determination. We must get to the altar, he said. We can't give this world to the dead. I remember what they did to. We just can't. We have to go. That evening, they had to walk several miles upriver before they could find a place to cross. Long ago, there had been a large bridge. Now, only half-ruined stone piers were sticking out of the river like rotten stumps of teeth. Luckily for the pilgrims, the spans between the piers were narrow, and the current on this section of the river was weak. They crossed to the other side and camped for the night. The old man recovered a little and stopped sobbing, but the remaining pilgrims were still depressed. Even Bubble wasn't in a talkative mood. The pilgrims decided on the order of the night watch and the general direction of travel for tomorrow and went to bed. The following day, they lost the stone face. The old man claimed to have felt the wave in the middle of the night, but no one could confirm it, especially since the city was still in place, in all its glory of the former capital of the dead. No one had the mental strength left for either surprise or despair, so they simply finished their canned breakfast in silence and set off. The next 2 days melted for Bubble in a strange mixture of monotonous walking through thick grass, rare rests, and observation of the town, which remained stubbornly in place. One day, they had to lie in a ravine for half an hour when a large open-topped wheeled vehicle, roaring and reeking of exhaust fumes, headed in their direction, carrying men in camouflage uniforms, obviously dead from the city. All of them were carrying weapons similar to those of the dead who had nearly killed Bubble in their shootout. Some kind of short rifles with curved things sticking out to the side. The dead peered grimly out into the surrounding steppe, keeping their weapons at the ready. After waiting for the patrol of the dead to move farther south, the pilgrims hurried away. Bubble didn't even notice when he was left alone with Chima, after the big wave or before it, on one of the nights. It was either fatigue or the degradation of memory predicted by the old man. The wave had been very powerful, so powerful that Bubble was totally disoriented when the world shimmered and spun around him in a surreal kaleidoscope. At least the wave had finally removed the dead inhabiting the city from the equation. The town itself had become an endless ruin, weird in its ancient vastness. Bubble couldn't remember much of his past life now, but for some reason, he was sure he had never seen such extended ruins. Before the wave, the pilgrims had been careful not to get too close to the city, so they didn't care about counting the dead, even roughly. But when Bubble and Chima entered the town, heading for the altar of chaos, the ruins of a conspicuous building still stuck out above the ruins as a landmark. Bubble realized that hundreds of thousands of people had once lived there. Everywhere were ruins of the apartment buildings, huge houses that no one had built for a long time and did not know how to build. Half-ruined, sparkling with shards of broken glass and piles of debris, dotted with gaping black holes of failed roofs and shattered windows. These ruins reminded that once mankind consisted not of dead ephemera and a few of barely surviving living, but of millions and millions of people who had built a gigantic and complex civilization. Would the altar of chaos be able to bring back all that former greatness? Bubble didn't know. He couldn't even remember his own name now. All that was left was that stupid nickname. But he knew he had to try. In the past 2 days, Chima hadn't uttered a word. Bubble shuddered in surprise when she suddenly said, "Finally." They immediately realized that it was the altar. Bubble and Chima had found it on the second floor of that weird building specified by the old man. Under other circumstances, they would never have entered the half-ruined building and climbed the broken concrete stairwells. But now, they had no choice. The altar stood in the center of the spacious hall, striking by its inappropriate cleanliness and neatness against the general picture of desolation. The elegant structure made of shining silver metal, opaque plastic, and some other materials unknown to Bubble was both alluring and frightening. The shape and size of the altar resembled a large drum with a diameter of 2 meters lying on one flat side. Small, bright lights flickered on its surface. Bubble headed towards the altar. The debris was rustling under his feet, but Chima walked almost silently. He didn't pay much attention to her. The altar beckoned to him, and it was impossible to resist it. Control panel. The half-forgotten word suddenly came to mind when Bubble saw the surface of the altar. Lots of keys, switches, and small round windows with arrows. And most importantly, a large red switch in the very center. Bubble realized that this was the reason they had come here. "Stand back!" Chima's voice sounded behind him. He turned around. The girl stood a few steps away. She held a long piece of thick rebar with a weighty fragment of concrete at the end, a ghastly mace of the surreal world of post-civilization. Chima's eyes glittered frantically. "Stand back," she repeated. "It's time to end this." A normal person's cheeks would have flushed from the rush of emotion. Chima's mangled face blushed furiously, making her scars look like a gruesome, fresh wound. Bubble raised his hand in protest. "Chima, wait. That's not what the old man meant. We just have to turn on the altar." He pointed to the red switch. "The new wave will pass, the world settings will change, and everything will be like it was before. You'll ruin everything." "That's the problem," Chima said. "Everything will go into a new cycle of hell. We have to put an end to it." She grinned and raised her weapon. Bubble bounced aside, and Chima stepped toward the altar. "Chima, no!" The deafening rumble hurt the ears. Bubble even looked around to see if the walls of the ancient building had shaken, if it was about to collapse like a house of cards. But the echo rolled away, and the building remained in place. The shot struck Chima the moment she was at the peak of her swing. The girl fell to her back. The rebar with the concrete head rolled away. A thin trickle of blood leaked toward it from beneath Chima's body, as if in a last attempt to reach the instrument of destruction. Bubble looked at the small black pistol and tossed it to the far corner of the hall. He'd picked it up when Chima was guiding him away from the crossfire and figured out how to use it on the way to the altar. It wasn't that hard to understand. Trying not to look into Chima's dead eyes, he stepped over the body and approached the altar. The red switch was calling. "I must make it right," Bubble thought, and turned the switch. The man, whom the pilgrims called Grumpy, stepped into the former equipment room and approached the reality multiplier control panel. As much as he hated it, the skeletons had to be removed. They could scare off the simulacrums at the end of the next cycle, and that could cause further difficulties. He hardly felt the frustration for the yet again bad news cycle. He got used to that over many thousands of repetitions. With each restart, finding stable simulacrums that could survive long enough to reach the console and start a new cycle became harder and harder. So he had to develop and implement this stupid tradition of pilgrimage to the altar of chaos, even though it didn't work every cycle. Of course, the girl couldn't have damaged the control panel, a device that existed simultaneously in millions of parallel realities was probably impossible to destroy. But he had to hand it to her. She had a lot of guts, just like the kid with the gun. But what if she had taken him down first? Who would have turned the reset switch then? Dumping the dry bones into a specially brought bag, he cast a parting glance at the remote. This time, it wasn't so bad. The replica of the city was almost exact and had lasted a whole few days. A few days that felt almost at home. And even though the city's population was clearly from a completely different branch of reality, at least they spoke his native language. He turned down a long corridor that went deep into the building. After passing several rooms already filled with bones, he entered one that still had free space and dumped out the bag's contents. There was no point in going back to the control panel. The settings shifted automatically after each cycle by one measurement unit, and he was afraid to touch the reset switch. Of course, he was almost 100% sure that he was not a simulacrum, but a true prototype of his personality, accidentally thrown into multiple realities during the experiment. He had already survived more than 10,000 cycles and retained his memory. But if he did turn out to be a high-level simulacrum, an interaction with the console could throw him into the instant time jump. He would turn into a pile of dry bones like those two, or even disappear altogether. The fact that the complete dematerialization of simulacrums had been occurring less and less frequently over the last few hundred cycles, replaced by temporal jumps, was encouraging. So were the low-level simulacrums from closer timelines. In the early aftermath of the catastrophe, he used to deal with people from the Stone Age. Who knows, maybe in 1,000 cycles, he would be able to create a reality almost indistinguishable from his own. He left the building and walked southeast, where a new group of pilgrims would soon begin their journey.